Hi, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Ordaniel, non-resident adjunct fellow and director of maritime programs at the Pacific Forum. As noted by a colleague in a recent TACnet, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed how people live and work around the world, and regional security experts are no exception. But I think everyone agrees that regional security and diplomacy remain as relevant as ever. So we launched this maritime discussion series in partnership with Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies to stay in the loop with the most pressing maritime issues in the region. This is an on-the-record speaker series that we hope can serve as a valuable source of expert insights into the current local and regional thinking and future challenges for maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. Moving to today's agenda, many experts look at the People's Republic of China as the single biggest determinant of maritime tensions in Asia, from the Yellow Sea and East China Sea in Northeast Asia to the South China Sea in Southeast Asia, and even in the Indian Ocean region. Chinese activities are being seen as disruptive and threatening. The most recent incident involving Chinese government vessel sinking a Vietnamese fishing boat is just one of the many incidents these past few years that highlight a worrying trend in Chinese behavior in many of the region's maritime comments. Joining us today from Washington, D.C., to put into context the China challenge in the South China Sea is one of America's leading voices on Asia policy. He is currently Asia-Pacific Security Chair at Hudson Institute and previously Senior Advisor and Senior Director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Before that, he was Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, where he simultaneously oversaw the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs. Colleagues, friends, please welcome Dr. Patrick Cronin.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope the technology works for everybody who is trying to listen into this program. I've been asked to describe my understanding of the China challenge in the South China Sea. And let me begin by just saying that despite the pandemic, Beijing is seizing the opportunity to flex its muscle globally, but especially on its maritime periphery. And recently, as Jeffrey just suggested, we've seen a number of developments, including the announcement of new administrative centers on Fiery Cross Reef and the Spratly Islands, for instance, the naming of geographical features in the Paracel and Spratly Islands, pressing to control resources and maritime claims, not just inside, but now outside and beyond the excessive 9-line claim. And we've also seen China's maritime forces periodically ram, sink, swarm, harass the various South China Sea claimants and neighbors. So I want to make 3 points about understanding the China challenge in the South China Sea, because for me, it means understanding Beijing's larger strategy, that it's waging a total competition guided by a long-term strategy for primacy in which information dominance plays an outsized and underappreciated role. I'm going to come back to each of those 3 points. Those are the 3 big points I want to share with you before we open up for questions. I do see this campaign threatening the basic strategic autonomy of Southeast Asian states, as well as US vital interests in a free and open Indo-Pacific. So let me start first by elaborating on total competition. Ryan Newhart and I used this phrase in a recent report published by my old organization, CNAS. And the label total competition is really shorthand for Beijing's variant of political warfare that harnesses all means short of war to achieve its aims in the South China Sea, but also beyond. I think the Chinese Communist Party is systematically seeking to carve out a vast regional sphere of influence. In the first instance, this means establishing a favorable set of rules, Sino-centric rules, in which decisions over resources and military activities in the South China Sea are made in Beijing. And more generally, this campaign applies to global rules, norms, and standards. But China's total competition also aims to displace the post-World War II security architecture, especially US alliances, with both asymmetric and dependent bilateral relationships, as well as with weaker regional and international organizations. Now, this also explains the marriage of convenience with Russia or even Iran and any other actors who will support China's desire to weaken the constraints on its assertive behavior. Tapping all means short of war to protect China's reemergence encompasses at least 5 tools: economic, technological, legal, informational, and military, and especially maritime military. Now, first, economic means loom largest because they are the foundation for asserting the CCP's power at home and abroad. Decades of rapid growth at home led to a Belton Road initiative abroad, and the BRI has been China's brand for exporting its newfound economic clout to regions eager for infrastructure in exchange for greater PRC influence. Now, even before the pandemic-induced recession, the Belton Road was facing severe headwinds over internal needs and a general lack of trust. China is wasting no time trying to pivot now from managing the health crisis to leveraging the pandemic experience it was first to have to reducing economic freefall. Now, economic power cuts both ways here for China. If China recovers first from COVID-19 recession, then it's poised to assume a more significant leadership position. But if China fails to recover rapid growth, having suffered 7% or so contraction of GDP this first quarter of negative growth since 1976, then I think Xi Jinping's grasp on power is thrown into jeopardy, and the road to great rejuvenation faces a huge impediment. And with Japan and other countries rethinking their critical supply chains, I think China is going to have to make some big adjustments. Now, part of that adjustment will come via the second instrument of power, of technology. Economic primacy amid an ongoing fourth industrial revolution requires superiority in critical emerging technologies, and the CCP, which is seldom accused of being transparent, is remarkably open about its intention to achieve the critical technologies that will drive this century's economy and military power. From its multifaceted Made in China 2025 plan, to its goal of dominating AI by 2030, to its seemingly benign pronouncement that it will win the race for creating a vaccine for the coronavirus. Now, just as the information-based technologies were creating the modern surveillance state, China hopes it can make strategic investments in telecommunications, robotics, and other fields to dominate tomorrow's supply and value chains. And whether selling smart city surveillance state technology or dropping in the 5G infrastructure for an Internet of Things, China will sell Southeast Asia on its own buzzword of connectivity. But as the pandemic should have taught us about globalization, there is a darker side to connectivity that states must give more weight to when making decisions. Now, thirdly, Beijing manipulates the law as an instrument of total competition. Indeed, total competition's economic and technological ends are advanced through a wider application of the PLA's 3 warfares, comprising legal, informational, and psychological warfare. The legal warfare, or lawfare, includes both efforts to create favorable rules as well as to nullify existing or potential rules, norms, and standards that stand in Beijing's way. So the single draft code of conduct China has floated in past months would guarantee China's ability to veto the access to the use of resources in the South China Sea, as well as Beijing's right to determine all military activities in the region. And if setting up an administrative headquarters in Shanxi City wasn't enough, now the PRC wants all to know that it has district-level administrative centers for the Paracel Islands and Macclesfield Bank and Scarborough Shoal on Woody Island, and for the Spratly Islands on Fiery Cross Reef. And as before, international law enshrined in UNCLOS is something to trumpet China's commitment to the rule of law, except when international law blocks Beijing's expanding sphere of influence, as in the 2016 arbitral panel judgment. Now, the informational and psychological dimensions of the 3 warfares can be melded together as a fourth instrument of total competition. And as with lawfare, China's use of information and psychological operations are hardly restricted to the PLA. The CCP has institutionalized both across the whole of government and society. I think the recent expulsion of many Chinese state-owned media hacks from the United States, frankly, was retribution for kicking out real journalists from China, but also a necessary means of curbing some of the CCP unified messaging machine. Beijing puts forth an evolving but predictably one-sided narrative where everything about the United States is in decline or destroying humanity, and everything about China is beyond reproach. America is declining, China is rising. To resist is futile, and risks of war and the Thucydides trap. And America's security is anachronistic and alien, and all should buy into China's dominant role in exchange for development and peace. Those are some of the meta messages that you can read over and over again every day in the Chinese press. Now, influence operations are perpetuated by the United Front Work Department through social media, Chinese language sources, academic exchanges, many other means. But information is more than narrative, propaganda, and influence. And I'm going to return to this idea shortly. But first, the fifth and final tool China is using in its total competition quest for controlling the South China Sea is military power, particularly maritime power. I put this tool fifth because I also want to highlight China's desire to achieve its goals without necessary force, that is, to win without fighting. If we see military power as some discrete tool on its own, at least here in the United States often, China preps the battlefield like the preparation for a pandemic, investing in the right capacity, conducting surveillance, controlling information, executing a whole of society people's war approach, and seeking to achieve a short, swift victory. Now, Beijing wishes to create a military capable of destroying America's power projection capabilities, leaving the region vulnerable to China's predations, and enabling the PLA to reach out beyond the second island chain so there is no sanctuary in Japan, Australia, Hawaii, or elsewhere. Much of the military focus is maritime, beginning with China's three navies, so-called the PLA, the Coast Guard, the Maritime Militia, as well as its vast fishing fleet and oil rigs and scientific ships. Now, I've written separately and recently about China's bid for maritime primacy on, over, and under the surface, and so I won't repeat that right now. But suffice it to say, China is building the largest set of naval and paramilitary forces in the world, backed by a formidable missile and air defense force and air force, and it's leveraging new domains in space, cyberspace, and the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, let me turn just briefly to my second and third major points before opening up for questions. The second concerns what we need to bear in mind to understand the China challenge in the South China Sea. That Beijing's relentless pursuit of regional domination is guided by a long-term strategy. It's something that seems in short supply here in the United States these days, but China, even with the pandemic, seems to be staying on its game. There are milestones along the way to achieving the China dream by the centennial of the PRC in 2049. Along the way, sudden shifts or moves are possible, including next year, 2021, on the centennial of the CCP, which is why Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet, and especially Taiwan, should all be on our radar. But so too must we be alert not to convey either a lack of resolve and interest so as to invite miscalculation, but nor overreact to China's incremental attempts at creating new normal that leaves Beijing in exclusive charge of running the South China Sea and the region. China has a lot to do to try to do that. And if we stand together and for the rule of law and for transparency, they'll have a much tougher time trying to gain exclusive control. The profound uncertainty over the global economy is at best a detour for the China dream. It is hard to forecast the sudden tactical swings that might emanate from shifts in China's domestic politics or the regional landscape. Thus, total competition is proceeding undiminished by the pandemic and perhaps fueled by Xi, who becomes desperate to extend his tenure as party secretary, and a Chinese polity held together increasingly by rising nationalism, as reflected, for instance, in the recent wolf warrior diplomacy. Now, my third and final big point at the outset is related to the idea of information superiority or dominance. If military power is central to the US security approach, information dominance plays the key role in China's strategic campaign. It is the red thread running through all of its instruments of power. Beyond narrative and information operations, China is focused on collecting big data and the means to infiltrate our communications, frankly, like this Zoom session, and conceal and encrypt their own strategic communications. Even though Zoom is a US-based company, they allowed 3 Chinese companies to develop their software, transmitted user data through servers in China, and used a relatively weak form of encryption, all of which likely provided China's intelligence services with greater access to people's private communications. I know they've made changes. Well, good luck trying to stay ahead of the Chinese government on this issue because they mean business on information dominance. China's embraced information dominance in a holistic way, just as information and data have become essential to the fourth industrial revolution era, an era marked by digital transformation of our economies, societies, and militaries. So you wonder why China is so keen to sell inexpensive 5G telecommunications or the components of an Internet of Things, really Internet of Threat. It's the threat hidden in plain sight, just as our dependence on China for critical medical supplies should have been an obvious red flag before COVID-19. Controlling Southeast Asia in general, and the South China Sea in particular, will be determined by whether we let China achieve a decisive advantage in information dominance. I need to stop there and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Cronin, for that very insightful analysis and for contextualizing the South China Sea issue and really helping us understand the bigger picture, if you will, of this very important issue, at least very important for us here in Asia. So now it's time for question and answer and for feedback. If you have a comment or a question for Dr. Patrick Cronin, please use the raise hand function located on the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please wait to be called and unmuted by the moderator before speaking. And please state your name, position, and affiliation before commenting or asking questions. Robert Gillier, President, Pacific Forum, sir.
First of all, thank you, Jeffrey, Dr. Cronin, for your terrific remarks. Bob Guerrier, President, Pacific Forum. Very illuminating, the perspectives and thoughts that you shared. My question is simply, what is to be done now that we have an existing status quo, if you will, or a new status quo in the South China Sea with regard to the militarized islands and their, if you will, creeping claims for jurisdiction? Some criticize freedom of navigation operations as being disruptive or precipitative, but what else should be done to accompany those actions?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to maybe add some thoughts to that important question. There are many things that have to be done, but we have to put it into the larger context, which is one reason why I'm trying to talk about this total competition, to make sure that people look at the entire playing board and not get fixated on simply one action in one part of the South China Sea or even in Southeast Asia, that this is a larger competition that China is waging. And yet it requires both local and regional and larger responses. I don't think I would criticize freedom of navigation operations, just the opposite. I think they are essential because they reinforce the longstanding American support for a favorable balance of power, for the open and free access of ideas and commerce. That's what America has stood for from the beginning of this country. And it provides a distant balancing that is benign most of the time, and should be benign because it should be solving problems with countries in the region. It should be doing more harm than good with our presence. We're not there to risk starting a war. We're there to deter the potential sort of aggrandizement of China at the expense of its smaller neighbors and to deter war from breaking out. We have to mean what we say with those freedom of navigation operations. We have to be able to have the readiness and the capability to back it up. We do not want to allow a gap to grow between our capabilities and our aspirations for leadership in this region. And increasingly that requires the support of allies and partners throughout the region. So mobilizing and supporting and keeping together, working with our information exchange, working with the capacity building, working on building better relations with allies and partners in the region is absolutely vital for the United States, since we're the ones trying to preserve the free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. For China, trying to make it exclusive to China, they don't necessarily have to mind what the region cares, especially if the institutions are not strong enough to stand up to them or can be divided, as with ASEAN. we have to have our partners stand up for the rule of law and stand together, because they're much stronger when they stand together, and China's much stronger when they don't. We have to be able to provide a long-term positive strategy to go along with our very capable hard power that we can project into the region, so that there is no doubt, despite China's growing capabilities, that the United States can, if necessary, come to the defense of our allies and partners and US interests. We don't have to have dominance over the region. We just have to make sure that China doesn't have exclusive control. And I think that defensive goal, which is supported by the rule of law and supported by the natural desire for strategic autonomy on the part of all actors in the region, is a winning strategy. So we have to have a long-term fortitude, but as some have said about responding to gray zone strategies, these sort of nibbling strategies of China in particular, you have to regularly mow the grass. You can't let opportunities arise that China can just seize and then make that the new normal, just as they did with their island building campaign. So we have to stand up every time they make these new pronouncements about administrative centers. I was amazed to see a declaration that they now have a mental health facility on Mischief Reef. I'm not sure why the Chinese military wants to brag about a mental health facility on Mischief Reef. But to me, it seems to me a vulnerability that if the Chinese military who are occupying Little Mischief Reef and the Spratly Islands are having mental health problems, then maybe we ought to play upon them. Anyway, I think there are a lot of things that we should do, but it is important for the United States to exhibit competent, long-term strategic leadership. And there are plenty of faults that can be enumerated by many people, both sides of the aisle in the United States, and certainly by others throughout the region. But we need our allies and partners also to be able to stand up. They should be supporting Vietnam as it tries to push back at what China's just done, or helping Malaysia. And we ought to be trying to have a unified voice. I've got specific ideas that we'll be writing about in the coming days on what I think the United States can do to engage the wider region on some new diplomacy, because we need more diplomatic activity, even in the midst of this pandemic, that reassures the region. Congress, meanwhile, is getting ready to potentially fund a major bipartisan bill for the reassurance of the region, and that would be an excellent step as well, where Congress and the executive branch work together to send clear signals about long-term interests and about the fact that we care to reassure allies and partners throughout the region.
All right. So I can see several hands raised. So what I'm going to do is just to call on probably two persons at a time, and then let Dr. Cronin respond. Let me call on Thomas Daniel and then Matake Kamiya. Thomas?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Jeff. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, Dr. Cronin. Thomas here. So in the South China Sea right now, there is a Chinese survey vessel engaged in what it calls survey and what I call a bit of intimidation in a contested block between Malaysia, Vietnam, and China. And what's interesting this time is that the USS America has apparently sailed out to join that little fray. So if I could pick, and some of the news reports indicate that it has conducted some minor flight operations, not too sure what exactly and to what extent. And I'm very curious now, when it comes to freedom of navigation operations, are we seeing something new, something different, where the US is now willing to show its presence in an area where you have Chinese ships as well as other vessels from the littoral states, where those littoral states are either unable or unwilling to sort of confront China in a way that the United States can? Are we seeing something new from the United States, or is this a sort of one-off? Thank you.
Kamiya-san? Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. very nice to see you, Patrick. I'm very glad that you stay safe in Washington, D.C. But anyway, I am very interested in your short remarks, and I totally agree with you that the U.S. leadership is important for us to counter China's challenge in South China Sea. But I, who are staying on the other side of Pacific, I'm quite worried that Trump administration has not shown much interest in China or South China Sea issue. Not China. I'm talking about the Chinese doing in South China Sea, despite the recent developments. For example, if we talk about the pandemic, corona pandemic, China didn't waste any time to convene a foreign ministerial meeting with ASEAN countries, but the United States has not done much to deal with Southeast Asian countries, worrying about the pandemic. Do you think if there's any way to wake Trump administration up to the growing challenge in the South China Sea and so on and so forth? And the other question is that you emphasize the importance of US cooperation with friends and allies. And Japan is one of the most important allies for the United States. What kind of role do you expect, or does the United States expect from Japan as an ally of the United States to counter the growing Chinese challenge in South China Sea? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both. Excellent questions and require some broad answers. Let me try to remember the questions and give you some thoughts. Beginning with whether the United States sending an amphibious assault ship, the USS America, to the area near the West Capella incident, where China is harassing and intimidating Malaysia and Vietnam, and doing so by expanding their ostensible control outside of the 9-dash line even. I think there, the United States is demonstrating the new normal for the United States is that it is willing to take greater risk to preserve good order at sea, to preserve and reassure the order that sovereign independent states will not be bullied and arbitrarily have to cave in to intimidating power, including Vietnam, which is in the chair of ASEAN this year, including the fact that China's been pressing for this favorable code of conduct, as I mentioned, in their own lawfare sense. And that needs to be resisted. And so I think the United States is trying to use its muscle to demonstrate support, show political support and moral support for China's neighbors, not to give in to an unfair set of rules, that the United States has always wanted to stand for a favorable balance of power and for free access and commerce, and now a free and open and inclusive region. And it intends to do that even after the pandemic, as well as during the pandemic. It is interesting that Chinese activity didn't just continue during the pandemic, but really seemed to step up, suggesting that the Chinese were testing whether there was a short-term opportunity. The USS Roosevelt was in dock in Guam with the COVID-19 problem, and other navies and ships around the region have also not been impervious to this. So it's important for the United States to demonstrate that no, the Navy and Marine Corps are still open for business, and the United States still stands for a free and open rules-based system, no matter what the distractions are in Washington. Having said that, I don't think the United States or China is spoiling for a dust-up. I think they're both just trying to send signals to the region. And the United States is trying to say, no, China, you will not have exclusive control of writing the rules in the South China Sea. Now, this goes to Kamiya-san's questions about leadership, about what's expected from Japan in particular, and what can be done. I'm not here to enumerate the challenges of current US policy, especially during an election year. But I do believe that even during the pandemic, but especially afterward and after our next election, the United States will find its footing again in terms of active diplomacy in trying to build anew the free and open Indo-Pacific that the Trump administration has outlined. No matter who wins the November 2020 election, and whatever they call that new policy, I think that's going to be at the heart of active U.S. engagement in the region, even though, yes, President Trump has a different interpretation of his own administration's desire to maintain a favorable balance of power, which is the wording in the Trump administration's national security strategy when H.R. McMaster was the national security advisor and Nadia Shadlow was the deputy. I think those things continue to be very much central to the administration's policy. I do think that President Trump could be doing much more to be active in mobilizing international support. I do think that even Secretary Pompeo and others could be more active in mobilizing a positive message here. I think even on the pandemic response, I'm surprised that we haven't really grabbed allies like Japan and Korea and talked about some serious international leadership on responding to not just the health crisis, but also to the economic crisis and the strategic issues of supply chain security that will come out of this issue over the months ahead. Japan has been a stalwart ally and a strong leader and voice for free and open Indo-Pacific region. Prime Minister Abe was very much active in every aspect of helping the Trump administration think through how to engage more effectively in Southeast Asia, as well as across the wider region. And now the pandemic has thrown us all into a domestic crisis. And I have to be honest that the United States right now is probably going to have an election that comes down to the handling of the coronavirus, including the fallout from the coronavirus, meaning the economic fallout and issues like China. Forget about South China Sea, just China at large is probably going to be a subset of this issue of the perception of the voter here in the United States in November of how well or poorly they think the administration and the president handled this. So for the moment, these issues have to be maintained, not give China an opening, an undue opening, and then hope that by the time we get to 2021, no matter who wins the election here in the United States, that we'll be able to come out with a much more active diplomatic agenda. I'd like to see that now. I'm just not confident that it will be able to focus as much, given our election year, plus the pandemic, plus the economic crisis that, frankly, the world is facing. So thank you.
Ralph Cossa, and then John Barnett. Ralph? Ralph, go ahead, please.
Hello? It says I'm muted by the host. Okay, I'm now unmuted by the host. Patrick, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ralph. Go ahead.
Good. Aloha.
Aloha.
You made a lot of references to allies and partners and standing up. Unfortunately, our biggest ally in Southeast Asia has decided to roll over rather than stand up. So how do you deal with the problem when the guy that you want to help is not prepared to help himself? Obviously, I'm talking about the Philippines and all the latest developments.
Well, Ralph, that is a sticky problem, and everybody's. We don't want time to go by too quickly, but we can't wait for the end of June 2022 when Duterte's term in office expires, because he has been a troublemaker for the United States from day one, for the Obama administration and then for the Trump administration. We need to keep demonstrating that the interests of the Philippine people, the American people, are deep and long and ready to grow, and that our economic interests, our security interests, our values largely overlap, even if there's disagreement about the leadership in these countries. Much of the work that's happened with our ambassador, with our military liaison, has tried to happen, as you know, below the radar, below the sort of direct firing line of President Duterte. But with the visiting forces agreement issue coming to a head, he really has jeopardized the viability of this alliance, but he hasn't killed it. And I think that has to be a saving grace at this point. We have to hold on to as much as we can of this alliance and relationship. We have to, in the United States, continue to try to focus on helping the Philippine people resolve their real challenges, whether it's their need for maritime domain awareness in some capacity, or whether it's helping them fight this virus, or whether it's helping them right their economy. We have to continue to focus on those kind of issues, including counterterrorism, despite Duterte, and do the best we can, and then hopefully get to somebody who is has a new vision for the Philippines in July of 2022. I know that's a long time away, so we can't wait until then. But I don't have a better plan. You know, you have to deal with the reality of what you have. Meanwhile, we go back to Kamiya-san's question about what Japan can do. Well, fortunately, allies like Japan have a better standing in the Philippines with President Duterte. So we need to lean very heavily on Japan and other allies and partners who can keep the Philippines honest about the challenges that China faces and is posing to them, you know, without drawing them into a conflict, which we understand the Philippines doesn't, you know, and nobody wants in the region. So it's a balancing act for us to just preserve the most we can out of this relationship, knowing that we really do have a great opportunity to preserve a democracy in Asia. And I want to just say a word about that finally, because of what's happening in Hong Kong over the weekend with the detention of major democratic voices like Martin Lee, 81 years old, and you know, rounded up by the authorities on the grounds that he and others incited violence with illegal protests last summer and fall in Hong Kong. And why they're doing this right now in the midst of the pandemic suggests that there's a real problem with the CCP in terms of fear about the need for Xi Jinping to have a very strong set of control over Taiwan and over Hong Kong and over Xinjiang and Tibet, as I mentioned, but also over the South China Sea. So I think this is a very delicate period, and we're going to need the Philippines to be mindful that their strategic interests and their autonomy and their economy and their freedom are all in jeopardy if they don't maintain a better balance of power, which doesn't require US primacy, but it does require working with other countries so that China doesn't have exclusive control over this region. I do think our values align and our interests align. So I'm hopeful for the future, even if I'm not necessarily going to glow about the next couple of years of US-Philippine relations. Thank you.
John Barnett.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Cronin, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I've been to Vietnam 5 times in my lifetime, and I had the chance to live there a bunch of times. One of the things I picked up on quite a bit was Vietnam has a big belief in ASEAN to counter Chinese expansion, and I'm curious on what should the role of ASEAN be? You're talking about regional and local. What should that be, and how, and what sort of relationship should they have with the U.S.?
Well, you're right. It's a good point. And ASEAN is an important institution, and the United States needs to support it by showing up, not necessarily in the midst of a pandemic, but when there's not a pandemic, it needs to be showing its full support for it. Unlike the Philippines, which is more skeptical about ASEAN, Vietnam, as you say, sees its value. When you think about a code of conduct, for instance, in waiting for China to negotiate a code of conduct with the 10 members of ASEAN is never going to happen, at least if you're looking for a fair and balanced code of conduct, one that truly reflects the strategic autonomy of the 10 ASEAN members and not simply the interests out of Beijing. It behooves us to work with both Vietnam and ASEAN on maybe a larger code of conduct, a set of principles that Vietnam and other like-minded states could put forward as reasonable rules that oppose ramming and swarming and sinking, very basic things that everybody should agree to. And then maybe if ASEAN doesn't want to sign on to that right away, let Japan, Australia, the United States, and India and others put it forward with a few countries like Vietnam, maybe the Philippines, but maybe not, maybe Malaysia, maybe Indonesia, and then have the Chinese reject it and say that no, they want ramming and swarming and sinking, or buy into it as a basis for a code of conduct that every maritime power and country can abide by. I think that kind of hybrid role for ASEAN would be extremely important. If that's too far a reach, though, for ASEAN, because ASEAN still operates more in the economic political sphere, more at the lowest common denominator of security, they at least need to mention what's happening with Vietnam and Malaysia, and frankly, in the waters of Brunei, in terms of what China's doing to intimidate and harass. The Chinese are trying to make the claim that they're not doing anything illegal, but there's a line between illegal and unwanted that China's crossing. And the way they're selling what they can do with their survey ships and with their oil rigs, protected by, as the Malaysian Coast Guard pointed out, by more than 10 other vessels from the China Coast Guard. That's pure intimidation, just like the swarming of Pagasa D2 Island in the Philippines, or sort of intruding with the China Coast Guard now into the waters of the Natuna Islands, even though Indonesia is not a claimant state. So I think there are a lot of things that in the South China Sea, ASEAN needs to put on the agenda, needs to make statements about what they stand for, not against China, but just what they stand for. And I think that can be not only helpful to a country like Vietnam, which is on the front lines as a claimant state, but also can help build ASEAN's security reputation as a serious organization that should not be bullied by any single major power. It should be something that can balance the powers and preserve the peace for all of them.
All right, thank you. Before we call on the next two persons to ask, we have some really good question in the Q&A tab, and I just want to read two of them. First one from Charlie. What do you think of the announcement of the recent Indo-PACOM Section 1253 report and Indo-Pacific Deterrence Initiative to augment and boost the resources for Indo-PACOM? Will it be effectively implemented to support the security requirements of supposed priority theater? And another question from Crispine. Previously, integration in supply chains had developed based on false assumptions about how China would evolve. This meant most leaders inherited a trade relationship that was so codependent that for most challenging China seemed too economically costly. This pause in global trade means that countries around the world now have an active moral choice as to how its relationship with the CCP dictatorship should be going forward. Shouldn't the United States exploit this brief window by doing something radical like recognizing Taiwan's independence? I'll leave it up to you which one you want to answer. You can answer both. But
I mean, just the Taiwan issue, since that's obviously a provocative question. I'm not sure President Tsai is calling for independence. She's talking about, I believe, a free democracy and in its contributions for more international space. And we should be applauding everything Taiwan has been doing, frankly, as a model for how to deal with a pandemic, for instance, how they held a democratic election in January, despite the welter of information warfare thrust against Taiwan in January. I think and I think former National Security Advisor John Bolton this past week called for recognizing the independence of Taiwan, or formalizing ties again with Taiwan. I think, and I've expressed this elsewhere, that the problem with that is that our aspiration to support democratic Taiwan's freedom and independence clashes with our capability of making it happen. And in fact, our declaration could actually make the opposite happen. It could incite the growing nationalism that I've talked about in China, lead to lashing out against Taiwan. And China, the mainland, has a lot of weapons to do that. So we have to be very careful about how we balance this relationship. Having said that, the recent Taipei Act, which is the acronym for a long description of supporting Taiwan's relations, this is a good step, and one for me that kind of keeps the dynamic equilibrium going that we've had ever since we've normalized relations with the PRC. It allows for us to work closely with Taiwan and reassure them and support them, but at the same time doesn't cross the kind of red line that we frankly don't have the capability or desire to see lead to a direct conflict, and that frankly the democratically elected government of Taiwan is not seeking either. But it's a good question, and we have great support for Taiwan. So let me just leave that there. I'm trying now to remember the first question, which was about the, essentially, this was the Indo-PACOM reassurance initiative. I know one part of that question was, do I have any confidence that the money will all be spent strategically and wisely? Well, this is Washington. Do you really think that's the view in Washington, that everything gets spent strategically and wisely? There are politics involved in these issues. But I think the first step is for the United States to show bipartisan support for the reassurance of the strategic importance and value that we place on the region and our allies and partners in the region. So that in itself is the right thing to do. And it needs to be done. And I'm gratified to hear leaders on both sides of the aisle keep talking about it, even in the midst of the pandemic. Secondly, then we need to make sure that while we make decisions about how to spend those resources, we're doing it in very close consultation with our allies and partners that we're trying to help in the first place. If we're trying to reassure them, then they ought to be helping us determine what would it take to most reassure them. What would it be? Boosting their capability, boosting their information flow, allowing for real training and exchange, providing long-term support on cyberspace, electromagnetic spectrum, and the so-called new domains, working on the maritime security component at sort of in the large. Whatever it would take, that's where we ought to be focused on making some strategic initiatives that really make a short-term difference, but build long-term trust, capacity, and connectivity between the United States, our allies and partners in the region, to stand up for the principles that we all more or less agree on in terms of free, open, inclusive region. So I don't have any confidence that that will happen automatically, but I have confidence that we have the leaders now and in the future who will work to make that happen with allies and partners in the region. But it takes a lot of effort, and frankly, groups like the Pacific Forum and allies like Japan, the Philippines, and partners like Vietnam to keep us honest about how to make this work even better. So with that, we can now take the third question.
Go ahead, Laura.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cronin. I appreciate your time and your insight. My name is Laura Harvey, and I'm an APAL scholar from Pacific Forum. I just had a quick question regarding the health crisis that we're in. I've heard the idea thrown around that perhaps countries of the world should get together and sue China for damages regarding the health crisis. And part of me, believes that this idea is symbolically the right thing to do. The other part of me understands that China would look at that as bullying and interference. And I think it's interesting to kind of see how things have developed on a world scale, because I can't help but feel like before China really started to kind of come out into the world and take a wider role in things, there was maybe a basic understanding of a universal truth and these sort of like principles that we all kind of create policy and diplomacy on. But China is, certainly a member of the Human Rights UN Human Rights Commission, and they don't have a great record. They also are part of the World Health Organization. They have a lot of doctors and experts on that, and yet they have also been the source of a lot of pandemics in recent years. So, do you think China deserves some sort of formal rapprochement? And also, do you think perhaps that China is changing the idea of universal truth and how we govern? And what do you think the United States could do about that?
Well, there's a lot of interesting points that you've made along the way. And when you talk about China, you're really talking about their leadership and the party leadership and Xi Jinping. And I think it's interesting to note that there may be a growing gap between Xi and the party as the party tries to distance itself from Xi Jinping here in the next couple of years. We'll see about that. I think rather than going toward a question of suing China for reparations, we ought to be trying to work with China on accountability and holding them accountable. So I fully agree with that, and I think there's strong bipartisan support for holding the Chinese government accountable. So we want to eventually work with allies and partners around the world internationally to get to the bottom of what did happen with this pandemic. And I don't want to spread conspiracies about origins and so on, but we need to know more about the origins. We need to know about the early miscues and missteps, as well as what was done right, so we can be in a position to mitigate and hopefully prevent further pandemics in the future. There will be future pandemics, but we need to learn a great deal about that. You're right. I think that China has taken a really critical blow to the trust that it has in the United States, but I think in the world. And it's desperately trying to restore that trust, but having broken it, it's going to be a very hard slog to do that quickly. The way that China could do that effectively would be to allow for genuine transparency and accountability. And yet I don't sense that they're going to be quick and eager to open up their virology lab or their other sort of research institutions for a quick audit by the international community. So we may never get to the bottom of exactly what has happened here, may never get the full truth. And the best we may be able to expect is to try to keep forcing China to be more transparent about critical issues regarding what could be international health crises, making sure that we do all share best practices and lessons learned. And remember that there's still no substitute for our own effective handling of trying to deal with an epidemic or pandemic. And that requires, as several people have now written, and I've written recently, in terms of investment in public health, a clear framework for the legal aspects of information technology, whether we're going to use our smartphone data and how we're going to restrict it so that we retain privacy, even while we harness that data for public health. And we're going to have to make sure that we are building up the expertise and the people who can be part of effective responses. Basically, public health is part of national security, and we should have seen that. But finally, we also need to disentangle some of our supply chains, including for critical medical supplies and for drugs, so that we're not wholly dependent on a country where there is a lack of trust, where there is a lack of transparency, in this case, China. So I'm trying to essentially slice this halfway and say that, yes, let's hold China accountable. Don't go after the money. That seems gratuitous at this point. Maybe the bill will be coming later, but at this point, that's not where I would start. I would start by trying to make sure we understand the facts, and then making sure we're dealing effectively with the crisis ourselves. Thirdly, joining other allies and partners to advance the kind of systems, investments, and procedures and training that we'll need to fend off future pandemics. That we're coordinating, fourthly, on the global economic fallout of this, which is longstanding, which will now require changes to things like supply chains. And then fifthly, that we're sorting out our complex relationship with China as we go forward, especially for the United States in this election year, with maybe a different posture next year that is guarded, very nationalistic on both sides, but still looking for the level of cooperation and trade that can keep the global order from tipping into to chaos. So that's a long answer to a good set of questions.
All right. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We have 2 minutes left. We have 9 raised hands, and we
Oh
can't
dear.
obviously take all of them. So I'm just gonna end it here and thank Dr. Cronin for your time and the expert analysis of the issues. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We hope to have you again next week for a Maritime discussion series number 2 with Professor Narushiki Michita of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies and John Bradford of YCAPS. The topic will be Japan's strategy for Indo-Pacific maritime security. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.